And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in the Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And with me again is Larry Siegel from way up north, where I'm assuming it was probably 65 degrees today.
No, it was in the upper 70s, almost 80.
Okay, well, it was
Not bad.
90 something here today. So in southern Oklahoma. Anyway, it's good to have Larry back. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm president of Preterist Research Institute, and we do appreciate you joining us again as we're going to continue our discussion of the Messianic Temple here in just a couple of moments. Larry, I did hear from William just a few moments ago,
I see.
and yeah, he has made it back, and he will be available to get me back on air with me on October the 1st. So anyway, we'll have you back a couple of more times. Pardon me, after tonight, if you're up to that task.
No problem. I was going to say, every month has a first.
Yeah, he
So,
said October the 1st.
October the 1st. Well, every year has an October. So,
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, he told me he and Leora have a wedding anniversary celebration planned.
wow.
And so, nonetheless, he will be back with us on October the 1st. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you filling in during this period of time. It's been very, very enjoyable. And I think we've been able to have some great discussions.
Likewise.
Yeah. So, how's the week going?
It is going really well. We had some excitement over the weekend there in the service, and 3 baptisms, and just so many good people around us here. I just can't express my thankfulness to God for allowing me to come out here and work with this congregation. It's great.
Yeah. I mean, that's exciting stuff. I mean, anytime you have people ready to turn their life over to the Lord, that's just, that's exciting. Really is. And, I can't help but think that the more society degrades, the more people are looking for answers.
Yeah.
They're looking for whatever you would like to call it. They're looking for comfort. They're looking for truth. They're looking for something to answer what's going on in this crazy world that we're living in.
I think that's absolutely right. There's so much plastic in the world. Or, by the way, I had some shoes the other day. I pulled them out. They said genuine plastic on it. Genuine plastic.
Genuine plastic, not fake plastic.
Right.
Genuine plastic. Yeah. Oh, that's
There's
great.
there is so much plastic in our world around us. People are looking for something authentic and real and something they can relate to. And so, yeah.
I'm reminded of the book by Green. I think it's Michael Green. That may I've forgotten the first name. Uh, Evangelism in the Early Church. Really, really an excellent book, even if I can't remember his first name. But Green is the last name. Anyway, he was commenting on the horrific morality of the first century. He was commenting on the horrible injustice, the incredible cruelty of the ancient world. And that was from the top down. He chronicles the immorality of all of your Roman Caesars, of the absolute total 100% lack of humanity and human rights given to slaves. And it's sometimes estimated that over half of the population of Rome were slaves. A city of 1 million people, over half of them were slaves. And a slave had zero rights. The master could literally. There was a book came out some years ago entitled "Everyday Life in the First Century" or something to that effect, and it was chronicling what the life of a slave was. If a slave owner decided that he just didn't like this slave over here for whatever reason, they actually had an office you could go to. We'll use modern terminology here, and you could hire some men to go get the slave to kill him. And basically, all you had to do is pay a small fee and pay for the pitch to burn the body.
Wow.
There were no legal repercussions. The slave had no court of appeal. He had no rights whatsoever.
Well,
So
I've learned in my own case just to say yes, dear.
yeah,
Not quite the same
not quite,
situation.
not quite. So anyway, Green was pointing out here is Christianity that appeared on the scene. And let me make one other observation. In the entire pantheon of gods and goddesses of the Roman world, and the Romans had adopted the gods and goddesses of the Greeks, you know, Astarte, Molech, just under different names, and Dionysius. I mean, on and on. Okay. In the Roman pantheon of gods, basically the only god was sex and drunkenness. That's just about summarizes the fundamental theology of the gods and goddesses of the first century. And so Green points out how debauched that world was. And while certainly the majority of people were not willing to abandon that, there was a very, very significant number and percentage of the population that was sick and tired of the immorality, the corruption, the injustice, the cruelty. And he points out how women in the first century, now there were certainly some exceptions to that, but by and large, women didn't have any rights either. Infanticide was widespread. You know, they had a field in Rome where if parents didn't want a baby, which in 90% of the cases was a girl, a female baby, they just take it to the field and lay it down and walk off.
Yeah.
That's how they dealt with infant mortality rates in the first century. And so he makes this observation, Green does. In the first century, the gods did not abandon man because man was so corrupt and immoral. Man deserted the gods because they were so immoral.
That's right.
And here comes Christianity into this horrific world and offering women status, respect, love, offering slaves. There is neither bond nor free.
That's right.
And I have said this many, many, many times. To me, out of all of the revolutionary things that Jesus said and did during his ministry, out of all of the revolutionary things that Paul wrote, to me, the most revolutionary book in the New Testament is the little book of Philemon.
Yeah.
I mean, it was world changing. And well, I won't go into I won't get on my soapbox about that, but it was revolutionary to a staggering degree. Here Paul is talking to a slave owner whose slave, Onesiphorus, has run away. And Paul sends him back with this little bitty epistle telling Philemon, do not treat him as a slave. You treat him as a brother because you love me.
That's right. That was a
Unparalleled.
foreign concept.
Oh, a totally foreign concept. And I have said many times, had the 19th century Christian church in America understood that message, there never would have been a civil war.
Yeah.
So it is much to the shame of American, quote, Christianity, unquote, especially in the South, that it never got the message, or if it knew about the message, it failed to preach it and most assuredly failed to apply it. So again, back to Green, he's saying that when we find in the New Testament the little phraseology of at just the right time, it really was just the right time because people were sick and tired of the corruption, the immorality, the injustice, the cruelty of that world, the debasement of the human person. And here comes Christ. And he gives a message of personal value. Doesn't matter who you are as a human being, you are a creation of God. You are valuable. You are loved. And again, he raised the women to a position so that women in the church could be deacons. For
Yeah.
crying out loud, what in the world's going on here? And it's just such a staggering message of hope and purpose and love and meaning in the gospel that had then and has still the power to revolutionize people's lives.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. You know, Jesus in his earthly ministry, when speaking to the religious leaders, they accused him, you hang out with tax collectors and harlots and the bad people. Jesus said, yeah,
Sure do.
they're the ones who need it, you know.
Yeah.
So he raised that status up of people they wouldn't even be seen with, you know, Gentiles, you know, were coming in. That was unheard of. Jesus wasn't supposed to be talking to the woman at the well.
Nope.
So yeah, beautiful.
And when you see Jesus reaching out and touching a leper, when you see this leper approaching Jesus in Mark chapter 1, the natural reaction, the socially acceptable reaction on the part of, quote, healthy people, take up stone to stone this dude. A leper's just not allowed to approach healthy people.
Right.
But you have the perfect right to take up stones and to stone this dude. And if you happen to kill him, that's just his tough luck. And here's this leper, and Jesus welcomes him and says, "What do you want?" He's talking to him, for crying out loud. "I want to be healed." And Jesus healed him. And like I said, there's so many revolutionary, staggeringly so, revolutionary things in the ministry of Jesus and in the Gospels written by his apostles, that today we live in such a Christianized culture. And I know that people say, well, we're living in a post-Christian culture. Well, I understand the attacks on Christianity. Believe me, I do. But I watched a program the other night, and they had Stephen Meyer, they had Douglas Murray, and they had Tom Holland. Now, all three of these men are some of the brightest intellectuals in the world today. Stephen Meyer is a biochemist. He's a physicist. He's a philosopher. Stephen Murray is an academic journalist, investigative journalist, and philosopher. And here's Tom Holland, who is recognized as one of the world's greatest historians today. And they were all three talking about no matter how much people might want to try to reject Christ, they're failing to understand how, quote, Christian our civilization in America, as well as Great Britain, that if it were not for the Christian culture, we wouldn't have near the justice systems that we have. We wouldn't have near the health systems that we do have. And they just went down the litany of things. It says, if you eliminate Christianity, Christian morals, Christian values, Christian mores from society, what you have is chaos.
That's right.
And so it was a really, really fascinating video to watch. And it just, I pointed out last week in this book that I've been reading, I've got it almost finished now, that I want to recommend to everyone, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And it's by Justin Brierley. He is a British academic and philosopher, historian, etc. Brilliant guy within his own right. And he chronicles how across all fields of academia right now, I mean, we're talking the top levels of biochemists, of geneticists, of philosophers, whatever, across all academic philosophies and schools, there's just person after person after person who have been atheists. But because of the evidence, and there's getting to be so much more evidence today coming from those very, very, very stringent fields of chemistry, biochemistry, all of these schools, even a philosophy that is building on this work of genetics and DNA and what have you. All of a sudden, these scientists who have formerly been atheists are going, you know what, this is just not working. I just cannot look at the DNA strand that contains 3.4 billion points of information.
Right.
Each one of those points of information is basically communicating with all these other points of information to comprise the cell, telling the cell what to do. And here you have these protein structures, the cell structures, the genome, the DNA, everything going together. And like I said, all of these brilliant philosophers are going, okay, how in the world could anybody argue that this is just pure blind, dumb luck
Right.
that brought us to where we are? There has to be a God. This is so refreshing. It's invigorating, really is what it is. And I said this last week, I'll say this again. This is going to open the door for covenant eschatology in an unprecedented way. Because when you have these intellectuals of all disciplines who are turning to a faith of God, in God, obviously they're not dummies. They are going to encounter the problem of what I call the challenge of Christ. Did Jesus keep his word or did he not?
Yeah.
Did he fail? Did he lie? And I'm just foaming at the mouth, excited about my upcoming debate with Richard Carrier, who says Jesus was a myth. He never existed. And if he did, he lied or he failed because he said he was coming back in the first century. I'm sorry, the evidence is overwhelming that not only did he predict that, but that he kept his word. So
We should encourage all the viewers of the program here to make sure that they spread the word about this debate that's coming up with Richard Carrier and share that with them so that
absolutely.
as many people as possible can be watching it.
And you know, I have to admit, I'm feeling the pressure, but at the same time, I'm tremendously excited about the opportunity. And on the point that you're making there, I have a real good friend. He has an automotive restoration shop, and I talk to him quite often. I've sold him a ton of parts and all this kind of stuff. And I was telling him just recently about the debate. He's a very religious guy, very devout guy, and he said, "Well, wow, that sounds exciting." He said, "When is it?" Told him. Well, I was talking to him on the phone yesterday. And he said, "By the way, Don," he said, "I've got one of my customers, pardon me, he's a great friend." And he said, "I mentioned this debate that you're going to have with this atheist." And he said, he was just over the moon excited. He wanted to know the date. He wanted to know the time. How can he tune in, et cetera, et cetera. He said, because that's just down his alleyway. And I thought, well, if he's never heard of preterism, it might be unsettling to him, but he will see the apologetic force and the apologetic power of the preterist message.
That's right.
It strips the atheists of their key objection against Jesus, and that is that he failed or lied. I mean, it's just that objection just goes out the window.
You know what's amazing is I've only been out here almost a year. We go to the gym twice a week at this point, and people at the gym know that I'm the minister over here. I have unbelievers and others coming up to me today saying, "Can you remember my daughter in your prayers? She's going in for surgery." I mean, there is a hunger out there to know the things of God.
There really is. And to segue from that to our subject, now that we've been talking for 15 minutes,
Well,
but it's this boy, this is important stuff, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope that you really do see what doors of opportunity are opening up for us to spread the message of fulfilled eschatology and how this answers one of, if not the most fundamental objection against Christianity that the atheists, agnostics, Jews, and skeptics have been using against Christ for centuries, literally. And they think this is it. They think they've got the answer to Christianity. And guess what? They don't. They just don't. And so, yes, spread the news, folks. And let me also add to this, have me in your prayers. This, this guy is, now look, I've debated many PhDs. I really have. I've debated some very, very prominent men. I've never debated that is anybody that is quite as militant against Christianity as this guy. He's obviously very brilliant in his field, but his field is not exegesis. His field is not theology. He thinks he understands. I differ with that. I don't think he understands it all.
Twofold prayer for you in your presentation, and a prayer for him that a seed might be planted to open up his heart.
Amen to that. Okay, folks. So we're talking about the good news of the message of Jesus Christ. I consider, and especially in the evangelical world in which we live today, I consider the message of the nature of the Messianic temple to be extremely, extremely important. If you are a dispensationalist, or if you're just any kind of a premillennialist, then you know that the eschatological hope of premillennialism, oh, we got to have a yet future rebuilt physical temple located in Jerusalem. And after all, they're in the hunt for the red heifer to purify the priesthood so that the priesthood can offer the sacrifice and purify this literal, physical, material temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem, where once again a purified Levitical priesthood can offer acceptable sacrifices to God in this literal, physical temple. Unfortunately, dispensationalism has said and continues to say the Old Testament nowhere foretold the church as the temple of God. Nowhere. It's not part of the prophetic corpus. Number two, the New Covenant ministry, or I should say, the message that we get in the New Testament epistles, is not truly about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Israel. It is all about the church as an interim, emergency stopgap measure, since Israel rejected the kingdom, and God therefore had to postpone the kingdom, which meant theoretically he had to postpone the rebuilding of another temple, which is kind of interesting since the Herodian temple was there the whole time of his ministry. Did he really come to rebuild another temple, physical temple? I mean, no. Doesn't make much sense. So anyway, folks, when you start talking about the rebuilding of a literal physical temple and the restoration of a Zadokite / Levitical / Aaronic priesthood, I believe that the premier book of all to go to is the book of Hebrews. I've said many times, and I change my statement at different times, depending on which book I'm reading and studying and focused on. But overall, the book of Hebrews is one of my very favorite books. And Larry, we came to Hebrews chapter 5 last week. What did I do with my Bible? I had my Bible right here.
Well, we got two guys and I got a Bible. Does that count?
It counts. Two guys and a Bible.
A Bible.
Yeah. So,
they just pass over that whole verse that says, God doesn't dwell in temples made with hands.
This is really, it's staggering. I mean, it really is staggering that anyone could read what Stephen said, standing in the Herodian temple, one of the most magnificent physical edifices that the world has ever known. Literally, I'm not exaggerating. Tacitus, the Roman historian, says people traveled from, quote, all over the world, unquote, just to see the Jerusalem temple. And here's Stephen, good faithful Jew, standing in the temple, saying, quoting, by the way, from Isaiah 66, verse 1, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. Actually, he said, heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build me? And he says, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. And Larry, sadly, it almost seems that a lot of modern believers would join in with the Jews in stoning Stephen. It almost seems that way.
It does. I run into people every day of the week that are still caught up in a physical mindset of everything. Rather, they're like Nicodemus. Do I need to go back into my mother's womb? They're like the woman at the well. Can you give me some of this water? I'll go get a bucket.
Yeah.
They're thinking physically, God. And then when you say spiritual, they think, well, spiritual means not real.
Exactly.
Spiritual means more real.
Spiritual means eternal. Spiritual
Absolutely.
means the best.
Amen.
That's exactly the way it is. And people have to come to grips with this. So anyway, we've arrived at Hebrews chapter 5. Now, the writer has been leading us up to his main description ever since chapter 1, as we have divided it. After he had by himself purged our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. He's introducing the priesthood of Jesus Christ in the first two verses. In chapter 2, in chapter 3, in chapter 4, he slips in a reference here, a reference there, a little snippet here, a little snippet there of the priesthood. Now he comes to chapter 5, as we have it, and he decides to expand on what he has just said in chapter 4, verse 15. We do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with our infirmities, but was tempted in all points like we are, yet without sin. And now, like I said, he begins his discussion. What is the very first contrast between the old covenant priest and the priesthood of Christ, Larry?
Well, in the first verse of chapter 5, it talks about the high priest chosen from among men. And then as he goes down through here, it talks about Christ not exalting himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." The difference was Jesus wasn't chosen from among men. He came from the wrong tribe to be part of that priesthood, but God appointed him the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek.
And you said a whole mouthful there. By the way, I have thought this very, very often. In Hebrews chapter 5, notice every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in all things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices. Now, at the time this was written, and I always love to try to get a better understanding of the what the German scholars call the zets in Leben, the life situation. And at the time this is written, he just makes a passing notice. He doesn't go into depth about the situation at the Jerusalem temple in the priesthood, but the minute he says every high priest is taken from among men, and they're going, yeah, well, yeah, boy, is that ever true?
Yeah.
Because the corruption of the priesthood in Jerusalem at this time was just off the scale. I mean, it was all about political power.
That's right.
It was all about wealth. Pardon me. It was all about influence. And so when he says, well, yeah, every high priest is taken from among men. Well, let's see, as I pointed out just recently in one of our programs, taken from a man among men means whoever was high bidder at the moment got to be the priest.
Yep. It was definitely a political power position that, you got into it by the back door rather than by, belonging to the family line of Aaron and so on. They just, who was the richest of them all able to do it.
It reminds me an awful lot of situations that we're seeing in America right now of people being appointed to extremely high positions of authority and power, not based upon their academics, not based upon their qualifications, but upon the color of their skin.
Right.
Or even according to their sexual orientation. What does that have to do with the ability or the knowledge and the wisdom to do a job? When I was being raised up, which admittedly was a long time ago now, Larry, my dad always taught me, if you want a job, get out and work for it. Prove to them that you are qualified to do the job. Don't ask for a job because you're my son.
Right.
And my dad was very well known in the Northwest Arkansas region. He actually had a good bit of influence. I'm not going to say he was famous, but he was highly, highly respected as a minister and a businessman. Okay. He could have got me a job. He got me one job in my life, but he chose not to do that by and large. And so people who get their positions by graft, by corruption, by bribery, or by who they know, chances are real good they're going to be corrupt.
And when it comes to quality in a very practical way, if I'm going down to the airport to fly somewhere, I don't really care if the pilot is a man or a woman or what ethnicity or if they're tall or short or whatever. I just want them to know how to fly the plane, adequately and be excellent at it. That's the only requirement.
That's all I ask. Uh, I don't want the pilot getting on the intercom saying, "Do we have anybody knows what this red button on my right hand side up here is? What are these things called flaps?
Yeah.
Can somebody tell me what this thing right here is?" No. uh, it's really sad. It really is sad. But again, the writer here, I think, is very subtly taking a shot at the Jerusalem high priest. He's got Annas and Caiaphas, you know,
Yeah.
father, son-in-law, I think is the way that went. And they were known for their corruption, for their graft, for their dishonesty.
Yeah, I think he makes a statement there in verse 4 that's pertinent. He says, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was."
Yeah.
There's the requirement.
And there's the shot.
Exactly.
That's a shot across the bow of high priest that had served in the priesthood at Jerusalem for generation after generation after generation of men. And as I pointed out just recently, this goes all the way back to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes.
Yeah.
And Jason and Menelaus, who purchased the high priest office. And it came forward into the time of Herod the Great, even. The high priesthood was just open to the high bidder. That says nothing about qualifications. It says nothing about his righteousness, his law keeping, his holiness, how pure he was. Matter of fact, under that system, it said probably he's dishonest, he's cruel, he may be a man of violence. And I haven't been able to find this explicitly in Torah, but my friend in Israel, who is that I mentioned so many times, he says it was against the Jewish law for any man who had blood on his hands in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
That's from inciting physical violence against someone, even if you had a mugged, so to speak. Any man that was guilty of that kind of violence, that kind of background, was automatically disqualified from being a high priest. High priest is not allowed to have blood on his hands. And Anna and Caiaphas, they were bloody men.
Yeah. There are a lot of people today in the religious world and in the secular society that are in positions or in works of authority that they have over people that they abuse that authority, and they have no right to be there. And none of us are perfect, but you know what I'm saying.
Oh, I know that
You're
very well.
disqualified.
I have encountered men. Unfortunately, I've encountered some of them in the church, men who became elders, who should have been ushers instead of elders.
Right.
Not even sure they could handle the job of being an usher without that authority going to their head. But yeah, I have encountered men in positions of business authority who became nothing but tyrants.
Yeah.
And my wife worked for a business. She actually took the place of another woman that was literally driving the business over which she was a manager, driving into the ground. And she told my wife, "I want my employees to fear me." Really? In a business environment, you want your employees to be afraid of you?
It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And so this whole
Respect is earned. Respect is earned, not
respect is earned.
dominant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, Larry, why don't you give us your comments here? Says verse 2 that so that he can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Now, doesn't this reflect back on chapter 4, verse 15?
It does.
16, excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely, because it says that Jesus was tempted in all manner as we are, yet without sin, but he understands our weaknesses. He understands who we are and where we are, and he's able to minister to us on that basis.
Yeah. Now I'm going to jump ahead of us here just a little bit in verse 8 and 9. Though he were a son, yet he learned obedience. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here for a moment. Larry, how can God incarnate learn anything? Isn't God omniscient? Does he not know all things? So how can it be said of Jesus, though he were a son, yet he learned obedience?
Well, I'm not sure where you are on this, but in Philippians, it talks about the fact that he laid these things aside. And we know that he was limited in a lot of ways to the human condition while he came here. And, he said, no one knows the day or the hour, not the angels, not the Son, but the Father only. Well, that's while he was on the earth, right? In that sense, he wasn't everywhere present while he was on the earth. He got tired, he got hungry, all the human condition was with him. And it tells us in the time when he was growing up there in the household of Mary that he grew in wisdom and he grew in stature
and knowledge.
and knowledge. It was over the course of time and maturity, and he learned obedience. I think the Hebrew writer here prefaces this back with the first line of verse 7, where it says, in the days of his flesh. That is an important phrase that most of the world today doesn't understand the concept. But that was the time for learning, growing, learning obedience to the things he suffered, thus qualifying him to become the author of eternal salvation.
I agree with every single thing that you've said, and I've heard this debated in a lot of different circles. Well, if he's omniscient, if he's God incarnate, then he knew all things. But that completely ignores, not purposefully, it's just an oversight, but it completely ignores the fact that he had to learn the human existence. He had to learn what it was like if mom says, Jesus, stop that, whack. you know.
And verse 9 says, and being made complete, being made perfect,
Yes.
he became. So, I mean, yes, we believe he was God incarnate, absolutely, but he limited himself in those ways to experience the human condition.
Yes. Yeah, and the passage you alluded to is so incredibly powerful. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be counted equal with God, but he divested himself.
Right.
And he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. He took upon himself the form of a servant, being found in fashion as a man. And so the writer, Paul, is emphasizing virtually every way that he can of how subservient, truly subservient Jesus became by leaving heaven. And, I was listening to Dr. Carrier just today, as a matter of fact, in one of his lectures, ridiculing the idea of the incarnation. And he calls Jesus from outer space. Well, you can deride that concept all that you want to, but all you're doing is deriding one of the most awesome concepts the world has ever known, and that is that God loved his creation so much, wanted to save his creation so much, that number one, his justice demanded justice.
Yeah.
His righteousness demanded justice. His mercy and his grace provided justice through the substitutionary death of his own son. Nobody else could make that sacrifice. God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Peradventure, a righteous man, someone right there to die for a righteous man, but God commendeth his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So to mock and to ridicule the idea of the incarnation of Christ is mocking the greatest story of love that the world has ever known.
How many times have you heard people objecting, saying, you people that believe in this covenant eschatology stuff, you don't believe in substitutionary atonement? Yes, we do. Absolutely.
I would suggest that those of us who believe in covenant eschatology believe in the substitutionary death of Christ more than they do.
Yeah.
As you know, Larry, I wrote a book entitled The Death of Adam and the Life of Christ.
I have it right over here.
And
Yep.
I have an extended discussion of the substitutionary death of Christ in that book. And I believe that the traditional views of the substitutionary death of Christ are what are a great part of the problem of eschatology.
I agree.
Because, well, a preterist has accused me of being a heretic, accused me of teaching false doctrine, because I say that it was not the physical death on the cross that was his substitutionary death. He says that's false doctrine, it's heresy. Well, my response to that is the definition of substitution means in the place of, in the stead of. Okay. If you're under the death penalty and I say, I'm going to die in Larry's place, then Larry doesn't have to die.
Yeah.
I'm going to die in your place. Okay. So if the physical death of Christ was substitutionary, was his substitutionary death, then since he died in my place physically, I should never have to die physically. I've got a pretty good idea of how many people have died since Jesus uttered those words up to the present moment. There's 100% track record percentages of everybody except the generation now living that have died physically. Even the most faithful Christian in all the world has died up to this present time. And guess what? I'm going to die physically. You're going to die physically. The person who made this objection and this accusation is going to die physically. What happened to the physical substitutionary death of Jesus?
Jesus had to die a twofold death, the death of Adam, and to fulfill the sacrificial system of the law and
Exactly
the
right.
animal sacrifice to provide forgiveness of sins based on his shed blood. There is a twofold application there. If he didn't die Adam's death, then guess what? We're still under the condemnation that came into the world through Adam. And that's just not the case.
Right. You know, one has to ask the question, what good has Christ done us if, in fact, the substitutionary death of Christ was his physical death? Because as I just said, and as you were pointing out there, everybody's going to die physically. So what did that physical substitutionary death of Christ, which was his sacrifice as the high priest to serve in the perfect, more heavenly tabernacle and temple? You know, where's the effect of it? Where's the impact of it? Where's the benefit of it if I still have to die? And as this preterist says, we all die today because we are sinners.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if I die because I'm a sinner, then the wage of sin is still being applied to my life, physical death. And it gets back to that question, what good did Jesus do me? I can't be forgiven of my sin, meaning my sin is taken away, if I still have to die because I'm a sinner. Where is forgiveness? And so, and I develop all of this in that book, ladies and gentlemen, The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ. And I didn't bring this up to sell a book, but if you want to see this extended discussion, then get a copy of that book. You can go to my website, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. And if you order the book, The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ, if you make mention that you saw the discussion here on Two Guys in the Bible, I'll refund your shipping and that'll save you $7.95. So just want to throw that out there. So go ahead, Larry.
I was going to say, in the case of Lazarus and the discussion that Jesus has there with Mary, I mean, is he saying everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die physically? No, that's not what he's saying. So there must be another kind of death involved, the same one where he said, let the dead go and bury their own dead.
Yep.
The one that talked about the woman who is dead while she lives.
Mm-hmm.
Different kind of death there. And the reality is that unless we begin to see the fullness of that substitutionary atonement and that death and what took place, we're not making this stuff up. I mean, it's right there in the word.
Absolutely. And it's so critically important to grasp these concepts. And I understand that it goes against an awful lot of what the quote Christian churches has taught for centuries. But the Christian church has focused so much on the physical, as you were pointing out a few moments ago, and they're since they focus on the physical, they virtually ignore the spiritual. But as we were saying, the spiritual is the real, the spiritual is the eternal, the spiritual is the better. And so to disparage the spiritual, as one former predator says, there's only one kind of death in the Bible, and that's physical death. And when I read that the first time, I was like, what? you know, I mean, how many verses do you need in which it is said of people that were biologically alive that they were dead while they lived?
Right.
You know,
Over and over again, it's emphasized. Yeah.
yeah, it's emphasized tremendously. So anyway, folks, again, this goes to the work of Jesus as high priest. What kind of work was Jesus involved in? Well, you get a sense of this in the book of John. And I tell you, the book of John is just such a marvelously rich book. You know, I know that you're well aware of this, Larry, but scholars, many scholars, skeptical scholars, I should say, from the 19th, even into the 20th century, were saying, well, you know, the book of John had to have been written in the late second century, as late as 250 AD. Well, why? Well, because his Christology is so advanced. Because, I mean, here he is just constantly talking. He's almost on a different wavelength from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And look how primitive, look how simple Mark is. Well, Mark's pretty advanced in calling Jesus the Son of God.
That's right.
Hello. Mark is not nearly as naive as people want to make him out to be. But because of that preconceived idea that John could never have had such an advanced Christology at an early date, that took centuries. It took decades upon decades upon decades of contemplative thought, of church debate about who is Jesus. And so John, whoever this dude was, it certainly wasn't the apostle, uh, and whoever the apostle that Jesus loved truly was, on and
Right.
on the debates go. It couldn't have been the apostle. It couldn't have been anyone who knew Jesus personally, was an eyewitness. Well, whoever wrote the book of John, the gospel, said the one who saw all these things is his witness is true.
Yeah.
Hello. He claimed to be an eyewitness. And so presuppositions on the part of unbelievers drives their preconceived ideology, drives their theology. That's just all there is to it.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, there is another, where'd it go? Oh, there's another new book out. I have to dig out a single book from a stack, like this.
I see that.
Yeah, this is Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament. And this is by Jonathan Bernier,
Okay.
and he builds on the work of Robinson, A.T. Robinson,
Redating.
redating the New Testament from 1976. He adds a lot of really, really good information. So it's a book well worth reading. And again, it gets back to the problems when we're reading in the book of Hebrews about this priesthood of Christ and the Christology that is in the book of Hebrews is every bit as advanced as it was or as it is in the book of John, in the gospel.
What's amazing, the religious leaders there in the first century, they looked at Peter and John and they were amazed because they were uneducated and yet they had all this wisdom about them.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the point that I was getting at there a moment ago is if you got a book of Hebrews here, which is virtually unanimously admitted to be prior to AD 70, and it has a Christology that exalts Jesus above the angels, above Moses, above the law, above the temple, above everything. And he is the one, according to Hebrews chapter 2, God has not made or put the age to come of which we speak in subjection to angels, but to the Son, he says, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. So the Christology of the book of Hebrews is Christ has been exalted above every name that is named both in heaven and in earth. That's how exalted the Christology of Hebrews is.
Amen.
How much different is that from the book of John, for crying out loud?
Same
No,
thing.
same thing. Absolutely the same thing. So again, here in Hebrews chapter 5, and I want you to comment a little bit more. Here we have in verse 4, no man takes this honor to himself, but the one who is called of God, just as Aaron was, so also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son, today have I begotten thee. Larry, tell us when Christ was begotten.
Well, that's an interesting question there, because the verses that deal with his begottenness, they apply it to his birth, but also to the resurrection of Christ. So,
Yeah.
I've begotten you again is basically what's being said here in Hebrews. That was his,
Yeah.
yeah,
It
new
really
birth.
is. It really is a fascinating study. And one could say, one could, may I use the word conjecture, that at his baptism,
Yeah.
in Matthew, when the dove descended on him and the bath cold, the voice from heaven, said, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. Well, this is a recognition of his sonship, and yet we find later, Paul says this in Acts chapter 13, by the way,
Right.
when it speaks of Jesus's resurrection, and it says, of whom it was said in him being raised, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee.
And this was also confirmed at the transfiguration with
Absolutely.
Moses and Elijah present, the law and the prophets. This is my son. Listen to him.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
So there's actually a chain of references to Christ being recognized as the Son of God twice by the heavenly voice, by the Father, affirming his sonship, and then the scriptures themselves affirming that through his resurrection, he was begotten of God. Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Now, a little caveat here, you know, in the second century, you had some folks jump up, the Docetics
yeah.
that popped up, and they said, well, it really wasn't God in the flesh. It just seemed that he was God in the flesh. And that there were different times in his life that Jesus took on himself God-like qualities and what have you, but he really wasn't God incarnate. All of that's just, I'm sorry, let me be very, very blunt here. That's just garbage. When you follow this chain of references that from the very beginning of his ministry, the very beginning of his, as Luke would say it, when he began to be about 30 years old in Luke chapter 3, at his baptism, here he goes. He's going to embark on his public ministry. And the Father recognizes him, officially dubs him, this is my son.
Right. Well, in John 10, where he says, I and the Father are one, the Jews understood what he was saying there, and they picked up stones to stone him because he, being a man, was making himself God
Yeah.
in their eyes. And they understood what he was saying more
They
than
understood very
people
well.
today.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I absolutely love what Jesus himself said in John chapter 5. And I think it's a passage that's very, very often overlooked in Christological discussions. But in John 5:21 and 22, Jesus said, the Father, or from henceforth, the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son. Now, watch this. And as I like to say, you got to catch the power of this. This is incredible. That all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father. The Son is due the same honor as the Father. And the only way that that could possibly be true is if they are the same nature.
That's right.
They're not the same person, but they are the same identity and the same nature.
Yeah.
And yet, once again, and I've had tons of discussions with oneness Pentecostal folks.
Yeah.
When I've confronted them with this verse, you get that proverbial deer in the headlight look. And that's not a brag. It's just they haven't dealt with this text. They haven't dealt with John chapter 5:30. They haven't dealt with John chapter 10 and how the Jews understood Jesus's own self-identity.
Amen.
And
That's
that's
right.
critical.
They think that all we talk about is eschatology. The reality is that it all comes together. It all fits together. Soteriology, eschatology, the nature of man, the Holy Spirit, all those things come together in one beautiful package.
That is absolutely true, and it is even understated. I was corresponding with someone just the other day about last Thursday or Friday, and they were trying to make this point that, well, that's all you focus on, Don. And I wrote back and I said, look, you have to understand, eschatology is from Genesis to, as our friend Jack Scott likes to say, maps.
Right.
It's everywhere. It permeates and saturates the biblical text, but it impinges on virtually every doctrine imaginable. You can't talk about eschatology without talking about Christology, the incarnation, and the glorification of Christ. Over the last couple of years, I've been in intense discussions with some former preterists who say Jesus is still in the same incarnate body that he had, and that he has to come again in that body. No, Jesus never predicted he was going to come back, as I like to express it, as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body. His parousia was to reveal him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I said on one occasion, they were emphasizing, oh, he's still got to be in that same incarnate body. And I said, look, let me tell you this. Even if I were to grant that, which I don't, it doesn't matter what kind of a body that you want to ascribe to Jesus in heaven. Now, somebody may very well jump up and say, oh, Preston's this and that and the other. You need to listen to what I'm about to say. It wouldn't matter, and I'm going to be rather hyperbolic here. It wouldn't matter if Jesus was a unicorn, a purple, black, and blue and pink unicorn in heaven. The scriptures teach that Jesus was going to come in the glory of the Father, which is in the same way, in the same manner, the same nature as the Father had come. And the Father had never come out of heaven in a visible body. Never. Jesus was going to act with the divine sovereign authority in the same manner, in the same nature that the Father acted in judgment. That's what he says in John 5. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he sees the Father do. I've seen the Father act in judgment many, many times. I never saw him leave heaven. I never saw him destroy literal physical heaven and earth. I never saw him come with literal flame and literal fire and with a literal shout. Never saw any of that, never witnessed any of that materialistically. But I saw him act in sovereignty to use this nation to judge that one. And as the Old Testament says, something like 82 times, God said he was going to judge this nation by using this nation that they may know that I am God.
That's right.
And so what did Jesus say back there in John 5?
Yeah. Honor the Son the same way you honor the Father. One other point about this is the fact that was the tomb empty? Yes.
Yep.
Do we see that Jesus came out in the body that he died in? Sure. But he was glorified and ascended into heaven. Now, do we know what his glorified body's like? The Bible doesn't give us any details about the nature of that.
No.
None.
And that's the point that I have tried to make, and I've vacillated at times. I've gone back and forth, and the more I study this and the more I study that and what have you. But the point of fact is, what you just stated is exactly true. We are not told the nature of the body. We are told that he prayed, John chapter 17, immediately before his passion, before the death, and before the end of the days of his flesh. And now, Father, glorify me with the glory that I had with you before time began. Well, what was the glory that he had with the Father before time began? He was in the form of God.
Right.
That was the glory that he had. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. I think that's the most easily defensible position
I
to
think it's
take.
I think it's significant that in the book of Revelation, John refers to Jesus as the Word again, you know,
Yes,
just like he did in the gospel accounts, just like he did
John
in
chapter 1.
right?
Yeah,
The Word.
that's
So
exactly right. Well, folks, we're out of time. I hope we've been able to convey a little bit of the significance and the importance of seeing the nature and the exaltation of the priesthood of Christ as he serves as the great high priest over the true house of God, a house not made with hands. We'll have a whole lot more to say about that aspect of it again a little bit later. So, Larry, thanks again for being here on Two Guys in the Bible. Folks, thank you for being with us here on Two Guys in the Bible, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'm going to say good night and
yep,
God
good
bless.
night. See you next week.
You bet. All right. Very good. Let me see. Now I end that.
Gonna say still says it's recording
Uh,
over here anyway.
yeah, there it is. Right? Yeah.
We can just do a second hour if you want to. No, have a good night,
Oh,
Todd.
there it is. There it is. I forget from time to time. Oh, well,